Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Grave, coming to you from the beautiful Grade 1 listed building known as Samlesbury Hall. We're going to make our way inside and hear stories of ghosts, murders and mysteries. Welcome to Tales from the Grave. This is the oldest part of Samlesbury Hall. This very room, known simply as the Old Hall, dates back to 1322. If the beams could talk, they would tell you some amazing stories of ghosts, murders and mysteries. But let's turn the clock back in time and look at the families that lived here. So let's start our Samlesbury Hall story with a gentleman called Gilbert de Southwood. He lived on the banks of the River Ribble with his wife and 3 children at a place called Lower Samlesbury Hall. Things were going very well for him and his family until a gentleman called Robert the Bruce came down from Scotland, ransacked Clitheroe and set fire to every building on the banks of the River Ribble, including Lower Samlesbury Hall. So Gilbert rushed into the forest with his family, came back and found the building on fire. He thought, I'll start again. And he chose this exact location. This is the oldest part of Samlesbury Hall. He built a huge moat around the hall to deter any more Scottish invasions. He was a very wealthy man. He employed quite a few servants and they would all live here in the main hall. The floor was a rush floor. The dogs would sleep on the floor, scraps of food would get thrown on the floor. And when the servants woke up, they'd have a good scratch and a good itch, if you will. The fire here would have once been a mini bonfire in the centre of the room, and the smoke would escape from a little hole just up there. Now the Southwoods fought valiantly for the king at Agincourt, Battle of Flodden Field in 1513, and were very loyal to the crown. However, things changed after 1536, when King Henry VIII outlawed the Roman Catholic faith, and anyone preaching Catholicism would be classed as a traitor. The Southwoods were ardent Catholics. Catholicism meant so much to them that they defied the king's rules. And for a while, Samlesbury Hall was a safe haven for Catholic priests. When priests would arrive, they were brought here and given shelter. The army were always watching Samlesbury Hall, and one priest was actually found executed, and another priest was found upstairs and also executed. And the Southwoods made the long journey down to the Tower of London. The only thing that saved them was the fact that fought so well for the king at Agincourt and Flodden Field, but they were literally assets stripped, and this gorgeous building then became the property of the crown. It was bought by 2 very wealthy gentlemen, Mr. Rafe Asherton and Mr. John Bradall, and they came from Worley near Clitheroe. And they put a lot of money into the building. They never lived here. For a while, this gorgeous room we're now standing in was actually hired out to fly-by-night tenants and used as a cattle shed. It then became a handloom weaver's factory, and then in the 1860s was sold to a very, very wealthy family from Leeds in West Yorkshire called the Harrisons, and for a while Mrs. Harrison ran a school here for young ladies for 10 years. You can imagine it was a very, very happy place to be. When Mrs. Harrison passed away, her husband Joseph spent a lot of money on the building. When he passed away, he left it to his youngest son William. Now William could spend money like it was water. Whenever dignitaries arrived here, like Charles Dickens, Rudyard Kipling, they were all brought here to the hall to give private renditions to the family. He became insolvent and sadly shot himself upstairs, but we'll talk about him later on. For the fourth time, this magnificent building was put up for sale, was bought by a gentleman of the name of Frederick Baines. Frederick Baines was the High Sheriff of Lancashire. He was also the Mayor of Blackburn, and like his predecessors, he too provided a lot of money to save the hall. He died in 1901, and for 23 very long years, Samlesbury Hall was left totally unoccupied. Vagrants broke in, there was the odd fire, the ceiling above our heads was about to collapse, the long gallery was in danger of collapsing, and local builders gathered like a flock of vultures, not to save the hall, but to take away all the building material to use them for buildings outside the area. On the 11th hour, the Samlesbury Hall Preservation Society were formed, and they consisted mainly of historians and wealthy entrepreneurs, and they formed the Samlesbury Hall Preservation Society, and they saved the hall. Now, as you can imagine, when it comes to guided tours, the most popular ones are ghostly tales, because this building has more ghost stories than you can shake a fist at. And today we're going to look at all those stories. So please follow me for our first story. So we're now going to leave the year 1325. We'll leave the main hall and make our way into the very, very first extension of 1420, a room known simply as the Parlor. The Parlor has quite a few secrets behind it, including one of the most famous priest holes designed by Nicholas Owen. We'll hear Nicholas's story, and we'll also hear the story of the ghosts of the fireplace. We've just left the early part of the 13th century. We're now in the early part of the 15th century, and the very, very first extension here at Samlesbury Hall. At the far end of the building, we have the chapel. We then have the reception area, and this room, the parlour, and above our heads we have the fantastic long gallery. Now, way back in the Victorian period, a gentleman called Mr. Joseph Harrison purchased the hall. He was a very, very wealthy textile baron from Leeds, West Yorkshire, and he thought, I bought this very, very beautiful Tudor building. Let's have a Tudor king and a Tudor queen installed here in the very fabric of the parlour. Above the door there we have none other than Catherine Parr. She was the last of the king's queens, and she came from nearby Kendal in Westmorland. And above the door behind us we have none other than King Henry VIII himself. Now the Southwoods would have been horrified at the fact of these two caricatures being placed here in the parlour, because they hated the king with a vengeance. He had taken away their faith, their Catholic faith. And our next story is very much associated with their love of this beautiful building. Behind me is one of the most famous priest holes in Great Britain. The fireplace looks quite innocent, doesn't it really? But here, it is very, very hollow. Here, very, very solid. If the Southwoods were harbouring priests and the army were in the area, they would bring them down from upstairs, open the front of the fireplace, and in they would go. The fireplace was designed by Nicholas Owen. Who was Nicholas Owen? Probably this country's greatest ever priest hole designer. Some of his work, would you believe, is so good it hasn't been discovered. And you can hear about our clean ladies from Land's End, John Groats, who've been working these beautiful ancient halls, who've accidentally touched something, and a roof was lowered, or a door was opened from nowhere. His work was ahead of its time. He was using slides, he was using metal, he was using wooden shutters before they'd even been invented. The king heard about him and said, I want this man immediately arrested. He was chased all over Great Britain. was finally captured at a place called Hinlip Hall in Somerset in 1606. He was then taken to the Tower of London. There he was told if you simply renounce your faith, you can go, but he wouldn't. He was an ardent Catholic to the very, very end. If you've been to the Tower of London, you'll find this beautiful ancient graffiti scratched into the alabaster plaster in what we call the Bloody Tower, if you'll excuse the pun. There you'll find Anne Boleyn's handwriting, beautiful, beautiful handwriting, Sir Walter Raleigh, Lady Jane Grey, and beneath that you'll see Nicholas Owen's name. This day I shall be with my father. He died a very painful and a very cruel death by being hung, drawn and quartered. However, here at Samlesbury Hall, his workmanship is still on display. For our next story, I'm going to make way to this lovely comfy chair and one of the finest ghost stories you will ever hear. What a lovely comfy chair. What I really do like about Samlesbury Hall is the amount of beautiful, ghostly, spooky stories. And this is one of my favourites. I have been a professional tour guide here for a good 20 years. And some 6 years ago, I met a lovely lady who opened her handbag and brought out a photograph of herself in front of the fireplace to my left. She was wearing Royal Air Force uniform, and the story she told me came from her heart. What I found quite amazing about her is she told me she was actually 89 years old, and she looked much like a lady in her early 60s really. But let's have her story, which marries in so well with the history of this very, very room. We'll turn the clock back now to 1923, and Samlesbury Hall is in danger of collapsing. The long gallery above our heads was in danger of literally falling down. The chapel wing was in a terrible state of disrepair, and local builders gathered like a flock of vultures to take away all the material and use it for buildings outside the area. On the 11th hour, the Samlesbury Hall Preservation Society were formed, and they consisted mainly of historians and wealthy entrepreneurs, and they're still with us to this very, very day. Now, to restore the building, they couldn't let any Tom, Dick and Harry work on it. It had to be someone who was highly skilled in medieval buildings, and that's one such person was a gentleman from Darwin near Blackburn called, wait for his name, Mr. Michael Palin. No relation to a Monty Python star whatsoever, but Michael was an extremely talented person when it came to renovating medieval buildings. He'd worked on Bodelwyddan Castle in North Wales, he'd worked on Bramhall in Cheshire, Hallingwood in Bolton and Levens Hall in South Lakes. He knew his stuff. He arrived here on a beautiful, beautiful June day, 1923, with his 4 apprentices. He gave each apprentice a different part of the hall to work on, and he chose this area here. He got his ladder, went up the ladder and inspected the joists above the long gallery. They were in a terrible state. With a hammer and chisel, he chiselled away at an old and eroded piece of stone, and as the stone fell down, he was horrified to find standing just here a little boy with curly black hair. "Look out!" shouted Palin. The little boy just stood there. The stone came down, grazed his nose and landed right in front of his toes. Palin came down the ladder to give this lad a piece of his mind. He could have been killed, he could have been badly injured. But the role was reversed. The little boy shouted, "You shouldn't be here! You shouldn't be here! Mr. Harrison won't like it! You shouldn't be here!" "Well, I've got a right to be here, lad. You stand back. You could have been badly injured." Palin turned round, climbed up the ladder. When he got to the top of the ladder, the little boy had gone. Strange. He must be a quick runner, he thought. For the next 5 months, he worked his socks off with his 4 apprentices, bringing new timber, new tiles, and Samlesbury Hall was beginning to look a bit like its former self once again. They arrived as usual for another very, very hard day's graft. In December that year, the blue sky disappeared and was filled with huge clouds full of snow. A wind whipped up, and heavy, heavy snow came down from the heavens. And it wasn't long before Michael looked out of the window and thought, "There's no way we'll get back to Darwin tonight, lads." Outside was a blizzard of huge proportions. He told his 4 boys, "Right lads, it'll be dark by 4:30. We'll have to spend the night here. We'll go into the forest, get lots of firewood and keep the fire going all night." The 4 lads complained, but they looked out of the window and they realised, if anything, the snow was coming down thicker and harder and all the roads would be choked. They made their way outside, trudging through the snowdrifts. There they brought back branches, twigs and tree trunks and made a huge stockpile of wood right here. It was dark by 4:30. Now in those days, 1923, you got no mobile phones, no laptops, no television, no radio. So really, in all fairness, the only form of entertainment would be a good night's sleep, really. The 4 boys got their bedrolls and rolled them out in front of the roaring fire. Michael got his bedroll around here. He was an ardent Christian. He had a few words to the good Lord upstairs, and halfway through his prayers, he was aware of a golden glowing light from the doorway to my right. The golden glowing light seemed to get brighter and brighter, and all of a sudden out stepped a very, very beautiful young lady in Georgian dress. She made her way across the floor, straight through Palin, and put her hand on top of the mantelpiece, and Palin heard her utter the words, "I hope my husband survives this war." Then she shimmered and disappeared, but left a crackle, a deep scent in the air. Palin swallowed deeply. His heart accelerated in his chest, and he nervously, gingerly became aware of another golden glowing light coming from the same door entrance. The light got lighter and lighter, and out stepped a 1642 Cavalier officer. Bandoliers across his chest, goatee beard, feathered in his cap, typical English Civil War officer. He walked through the apprentices, stopped in front of the fireplace. He too put his hand on top of the fireplace and uttered the words, "Hope I survive this war." He too disappeared, leaving a very strong aroma of leather and tobacco. By now, Palin is getting severely traumatised. As you can imagine, his mouth went dry, his heart pumped away nervously. He then gingerly, for the 3rd time, glanced to his right and saw another golden glowing light, a much smaller one. And out of that golden glowing light stepped the little boy with the curly black hair that had nearly been hit by the joist in June of that year. The little boy ran straight through the sleeping apprentices and out of the wall to our left. As you can imagine, Michael did not sleep very well that night, but quite surprisingly, when he woke up, he didn't tell the 4 boys. And when he got back to Darwin, to his wife and family, he didn't tell his wife or daughters. He told no one. However, 20 years later, at the height of World War II, he was walking past Samlesbury Hall, as he had done on many, many occasions, just to admire his handiwork, when he saw parked outside the entrance here a military vehicle belonging to the RAF, the Royal Air Force. He walked across the lawns. As he opened the door, he made his way to the entrance and saw 2 Royal Air Force personnel in front of the fireplace. One was a female in RAF uniform, the other was a male, also in RAF uniform. The door clicked, they turned, Palin entered the room and made eye contact with the young lady in the Royal Air Force uniform. He just stood and stared at her. Quite naturally, she became very, very embarrassed. "May I help you?" He just stood and stared at her. Her companion, the RAF officer, then intervened. "Can we help you, please?" Palin recognised the young girl in the RAF uniform to be the same beautiful young lady he'd seen walk out of that golden glowing light in 1923. He told her. She burst into tears. "Mr. Palin, I don't disbelieve a word you've told me, but I'm from the city of Leicester. I've never been to Lancashire in my life before, but as we drove past in the staff car, I shouted, 'Stop, stop, stop! I know this place. I've been here before, and you, Mr. Palin, have just answered my anxieties.' I had the great pleasure of meeting that lady. She opened a handbag and brought out a photograph of herself taken in this very room in 1943. She reminded me very much of a Hollywood actress, Deborah Kerr. As I mentioned before, she told me she was in her 80s. She was a very, very stunningly attractive lady, even for that age. A most amazing story from the beautiful Samlesbury Hall. We're now going to make our way to the chapel, a place that was built by the Southwoods so they could practice their religion, which of course was Catholicism. The chapel holds some very interesting stories. As you can imagine, in chapels there are some amazing stories, and we're going to hear two very, very interesting stories very, very soon. One relating to the all-American, all-Yorkshire hero, a chap called John Creasup, and another relating to the White Lady, perhaps the most famous ghost story relating to Samlesbury Hall. Over the centuries there's been some amazing weddings that have taken place here. The one wedding that really caught my attention was the marriage of a British Army officer called John Creasup from West Yorkshire to Gail John Braddoll's great-great-granddaughter. The Braddoll family, of course, were the second owners of this beautiful building. The wedding took place here. They had a marvellous reception, but John was a serving British Army officer. He was sent overseas to the garrisons in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh and Boston. His wife absolutely loved New England, and she thought, John, why don't you resign your commission and become a civilian? He thought, yes, I'm sick of the army anyway. So he left the army and they settled in what we now call New England. They started their own business, were doing very, very well. One person that recognised this more than anyone else was good old King George back in England, and he thought, these people need taxing and taxing again. John said to his wife, I'm working my socks off and all I'm doing is paying tax back to the King in England. He wasn't the only one who was paying tax, of course, the whole of New England was, and they got very, very annoyed. One man in particular was a gentleman called George Washington, and the Washington family, they came from nearby Carnforth in North Lancashire, a place called Yelland Redmayne. And Washington recognised Creasup's northern English accent and said, John, I believe you've served in the British Army. I'd like to know all about British Army infantry tactics because I'd like to throw the British administration out of North America. This country needs to be independent. Will you join me? I will join you. I'm sick and tired of this taxation. It's got beyond a joke. So John Creasup became what's called a Pathfinder General in the Washington's rebel forces. He was at Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga, and the final surrender at Yorktown in 1781. Now the Brits had gone, he was summoned to Washington's headquarters. John, I'd like to offer you a position in the new United States Armed Forces as a general. Will you take this position? I will, sir. My mission for you now is to encourage the natives to leave New Hampshire, New Jersey, New England. Don't care how you do it. Well, you could say that he was involved basically in the murder of innocent squaws and braves. But all good things come to an end when he was captured by the Huron, North American Canadian Indians. And just like John Wayne in a famous Western movie, he was tied to the totem pole and all of his men dispatched. For him, they had the death of 1,000 cuts. Now, Creasup was a Yorkshire lad. He showed no emotion whatsoever and was heard to say the words, "You'll get nowt from me." The Indians were quite shocked by his courage and they became scared of him because he wasn't scared to die. They released his bonds. He rushed back into the forest and got back to Washington's headquarters. Sir, I've had enough of this now, sir. I'd like to return to my native Craven in West Yorkshire, sir. George Washington said there and then, John, my country is indebted to you. You will always be an American citizen. He got back to his native Craven, died at the age of 72, buried, I'm told, up in Bradford. And every 4th of July, a member of the American Embassy will make his or her way up to the West Riding of Yorkshire to make sure the grave has been polished and has some fresh flowers on it. It proudly says General John Creasup, United States Armed Forces. And to this very, very day, the Pentagon are responsible for the grave's upkeep. Our next story is probably the finest ghost story you will ever hear. The story of a young girl called Lady Dorothea Southwood. She lived here at the latter part of the 1580s. On a beautiful summer's morning, she woke up and she made her way along the long gallery, out across the manicured lawns here at Samlesbury Hall, over the moat and into the forest. There she came across a very, very handsome young lad called D. Horton from nearby Horton Towers. It was literally love at first sight, but a huge problem for Lady Dorothea. When she came home, she told her mother and father. Her father was absolutely horrified. "We're Catholics, they are Protestants. You will never, ever, ever see him again. If you do, lass, I promise you, I'll have you sent to Marseille to live with the nuns in the south of France. We're Catholics, they are Protestants. He will never, ever have my permission to take your hand in marriage." If anything, this threat seemed to fuel their love. In the dead of night, she would leave her bed and meet young D. Horton. Her father warned her for the last time, "If you continue with this relationship, I promise you, I'll have you banished. We are Catholics. He will never, ever have your hand in marriage." He then told her two brothers, "Tonight, boys, do what's necessary." On a beautiful, beautiful moonlit night, Dorothea left her bed. She made her way across the lawns, over the moat, and towards the forest. There in the fringe of the forest, illuminated in bright, bright moonlight, was none other than young D. Horton. When he saw her, he very, very politely bowed. He affectionately kissed her hand, reached into his pocket and produced a huge engagement ring. "Oh, Dorothea, Dorothea, will you end this pain and become my wife?" She gratefully accepted the proposal, knowing full well she would be ostracised by her family. They hugged each other in the moonlight, and then they heard the sounds of shouting from the forest, and out came Dorothea's two brothers, armed with two very sharp knives. They maliciously, cruelly murdered the young boy right in front of her. Dorothea's heart was snapped in two, the tears spilled down her cheeks. She yelped in deep emotional pain and was dragged back to this very room, the chapel, and placed under house arrest. That night must have been a very long night for her. The following morning, she made the long journey from Lancashire down to Marseille in the south of France to live with the Catholic nuns there. On arriving there, that poor girl never ate again, never slept again, and she never drank again, and she died literally of a broken heart. That's when the famous sightings of the White Lady of Samlesbury have taken place here at Samlesbury Hall. Always across the lawns, and always in between the horse chestnut tree and the yew tree. Occasionally in the main hall. She's been seen by many, many people over the centuries, and I'm going to choose just two stories relating to her. We'll turn the clock back now to 1878, and in nearby Blackburn, nearby Preston, we have what's called textile rioting, and the army were called in to handle the rioting. Just the senior officers of the 24th Regiment of Foot were billeted here at Samlesbury Hall. Lieutenant Colonel John Paulina just toasted the regiment. "Right, gentlemen, we shall retire for the night." He climbed into his bunk, fell into a deep sleep. In the early hours of the morning, was woken by sobbing. "That's strange, not one of my men. Sounds like a female to me." He got dressed very quickly, opened the curtains and looked down from the long gallery above our heads into the grounds of Samlesbury Hall. And there, in between the horse chestnut tree and the yew tree, he saw a figure wearing a long white robe that looked to be deeply distressed. Now, being an officer and a gentleman, he got dressed quickly and rushed across the lawns and shouted, "Ma'am, ma'am, may I be of assistance to you, ma'am?" The figure slowly turned, and where there should have been a face was a hollow, dark cavity. The colonel screamed. He was no coward. He'd taken the life of many a Russian soldier in the Crimean Wars, but he was horrified. He came rushing back into the building, rushed upstairs, and reached for his British Army regulation hip flask and consumed the contents. The following morning he had breakfast with the Harrison family, and they laughed. "Oh, Colonel, don't worry. You've seen the White Lady. She's been with us since the late 1500s. The Colonel had no idea, but he was going to meet her personally. His regiment, the 24th, was sent to South Africa, where they joined Lord Chelmsford's ill-fated No. 3 column and invaded Zululand. And there on the 22nd of January 1879, beneath a rocky outcrop called Isandwana, King Katsuwayo, the Zulu king, unleashed his Zulu impis and wiped out the entire 24th Regiment. The colonel formed a square with the remnants of his brigade and toasted the White Lady from the centre of the square before he succumbed to the Zulu assegai. In 1926, a most amazing find took place here at Samlesbury Hall. The road to our left here was widened to take more heavier traffic. And as the navigators got to Samlesbury Hall, they thought, well, the old moat's been filled in, but the ground's a bit sodden. And they put what's called a herringbone drainage system across the lawn to Samlesbury Hall. One went in between the horse chestnut and the yew tree. And there they discovered the foot of an adult skeleton. Blackburn CID were brought in. They did a lot more excavating, and they found an adult skeleton. The sergeant in charge of the inquiry said, well, looks like a murder to me, but this lad's been here for at least 400 years. We'll never catch the culprit. On one finger, they found a ring, a beautiful ring. As the ring was examined very, very closely, inside it had the engraving, De Horton. It was none other than young De Horton, who was due to marry the love of his life. And that would explain why the White Lady of Samlesbury will stand over the only grave of the only boy that ever showed her any love, any warmth and any affection. The ghost of Lady Dorothea. I've never seen her, but she's very much a part of the fabric of this amazing Grade 1 listed building. We're now going to make our way upstairs to the Long Gallery and indeed the home of the priest's room, built by the Southwoods to look after priests, and hear a rather sad story. This tiny room was built by the Southwoods for one purpose and one purpose only, to harbour Catholic priests. Samlesbury Hall, of course, was a safe haven for priests. However, the army were always watching. We've shown the priest hole downstairs, designed by Nicholas Owen, designed for that reason, to look after the priests. However, the army had their suspicions, and every time they raided Samlesbury Hall, they never found anything, but they had their suspicions, so therefore they had someone watching at all times. On a bitterly cold night, way back in 1624, a priest arrived on the shores of Lancashire. He came inland, knowing full well the Southwoods would look after him. He had no idea the army were tracking his every movement. He hammered on the door downstairs. The door was opened, and the Southwoods, of course, immediately gave him sanctuary. He was brought up here to the priest room, given a warm meal and a change of clothing. He then settled down for his evening prayers. He had no idea the building was being surrounded by soldiers. 5 soldiers smashed the door in downstairs, came rushing upstairs, kicked open the door of the priest room and found this young priest deep in prayer. He was very cruelly executed in this very room by beheading. The headless corpse dragged down the long gallery onto the lawns outside, where the Southwoods were all forced to lie flat on the lawns outside with their hands tied behind their backs. They then made the long journey to the City of London, to the Tower of London, where they weren't tried, they were just literally asset stripped. Now the floor here was not a very pleasant sight, heavily spattered with blood. And when the Bradall family purchased Samlesbury Hall, every time they tried to clean the floor, it didn't seem to work. So they thought, oh right, let's just brick up the priest's room. It was bricked up until 1898 when the Baines family bought Samlesbury Hall. And Frederick Baines found the floor was still smeared with medieval blood. He thought, I don't believe in superstition. I'm having these floorboards removed immediately and some Victorian ones inserted. Those floorboards have become stained again. If you take a photograph with a digital camera, it will come up as a red stain. They say this is the most paranormal room in Samlesbury Hall for obvious reasons. Over the years, TV and radio firms have come here on a regular basis to explore the paranormal. And each person that's entered here has felt a different feeling. When I've been in here, I feel almost as if I'm actually at sea. It does seem to affect your equilibrium. Some years ago, an American TV crew arrived here and the American presenter spent the night in here. A rather nice young lady. She spent the night in here in a camp bed with a webcam on her. When I saw her the following day, she said, "Simon, you've got to look at this footage." You could clearly see her sleeping and the chair by her side slowly turned by itself, which I found rather concerning. But just now you can feel an atmosphere of dread and fear from this very room. We're now going to make our way into the Long Gallery, my favourite room at Samlesbury Hall, and hear the story of the Harrison family and the sad tale of William Harrison. Welcome to the Long Gallery here at Samlesbury Hall. This is my favourite part of Samlesbury Hall. If the beams here could talk, they would tell you some amazing stories, again, of ghosts, murders and history. But we're going to concentrate on a rather sad story right now. Here we have a .45 service Colt revolver bullet deeply embedded in the side of the mantelpiece. We'll turn the clock back in time now to the 1870s, and the Harrison family actually owned the building. Joseph Harrison had passed away. He left it to his son William, who was just 24 years old. Now William could spend money like it was water. Whenever dignitaries like the fantastic Charles Dickens would arrive, Rudyard Kipling, in Preston or Blackburn, he would invite them here to give special renditions to the family, which cost him a fortune. He spent money like it was water. In the summer of that year, the butler John Freshen came up the stairs here into the Long Gallery where Harrison was having his breakfast. "The Morning Post, sir." He opened the letter and was horrified. The letter came from the Scottish Bank in Edinburgh, informing him that the bank had just collapsed. He'd lost a huge amount of money. However, he still owned textile mills in West Yorkshire. He owned the hall and the grounds. But for some terrible sad reason, this 24-year-old man became deeply depressed by what he'd just read. He reached into his bureau and brought out a .45 service Colt revolver. He loaded the chamber, placed the barrel to his temple, pulled the trigger. The bullet went through his cranium, through his brain, embedded there, and the poor lad fell to the floor as dead as a doornail. Now, his ghost does in fact haunt the Long Gallery. He's been seen by quite a few people over the years, but on the overnight stopovers here, you're invited to bring your sleeping bag and spend a night here. There was a photograph taken some 6 years ago of a mother and 3 daughters from London. The 3 daughters stood here. The mother took a photograph, and out of the 3rd daughter was a 4th leg, a bit like Jake the Peg, if you will. This photograph was looked at with great interest by a good friend of mine called Gary Johnson, who's a medium. And I said, "Oh no, Gary." When they took the photograph, it was this beam here. He said, "Well, look at the end of the so-called beam. You'll see a riding boot." He got a book from the library of our friend Mr. Harrison wearing a riding boot with the same crisscross laces that were on the photograph. As you can imagine, when everyone's gone home here at Samlesbury Hall, it can be a rather creepy place to be. Downstairs you'll find a lovely lady called Sharon. She's the events manager here at Samlesbury Hall, been here for a good 15 years. She said it hasn't happened on every occasion, but when she's locked up at night time, she puts the burglar alarms on and she'll go to every room and turn all the lights off. On a couple of occasions, she's had her hair tugged. She's turned around, there's been absolutely nothing there. When I first started the tours here, I was told if I had any young ladies with blonde hair, they get their hair tugged. I thought, no, I'm not going to buy that one. However, I've seen it happen on 4 occasions, and the one thing I always do is look behind them to make sure there's no one there. And in the case that I've seen and witnessed, there's been no one there at all. As I tell this story, I feel as if our friend Harrison is up there watching as we actually tell the story. But we always keep the best till last. And by far the most fascinating story from this room is the story of the Samlesbury Hall witches. Now, they were arrested at exactly the same time as the world famous Pendle witches and sent to the city of Lancaster. As we all know, Elizabeth Southern, Anne Whittle, Catherine Hewitt, Elizabeth Devise, James Devise, and indeed Jeanette Preston, John and Jane Bulcock and Alice Nutter were all executed in the city of Lancaster. On the day of the execution, from the next door cell, Jane Southwood of Samlesbury Hall was waiting with her two friends, the Brayley sisters. They were twins. They heard this huge roar outside the castle, and Jane climbed onto the shoulders of her two friends and looked out of the grille of her cell, and there in the distance she could see the Pendle witches standing on trestles and watched in horror as the trestles were kicked out from underneath them. These poor people did not hang, they strangled to death. This was quite something quite touching, quite traumatic for a young girl to actually watch, and that's what Jane Southwood did. She watched the execution from her cell window. She then heard the sounds of footsteps that got louder and louder and louder. A key was placed in her cell door, the cell door was opened, and there was Mr. Thomas Cavell, the head jailer of Lancaster City Castle. Right, you three, we just dealt with that lot, it's your turn next, follow me. The three of them must have been absolutely terrified as they made their way into the twisting staircase and into the same courts that had just dispatched the Pendle witches. They stood in front of exactly the same prosecution and exactly the same jury. The prosecution consisted of James Altham, Edmund Bromley, Thomas Potts, Roger Nowell, William Holden and John Bannister. There was no defence counsel because no one dared take on the King of England. But there was a jury. Now, with the Pendle witch trials, they used a little girl called Jeanette Devise. She incriminated the whole family and she was the chief witness. With the Samlesbury Hall witches, they did exactly the same thing. They brought in a young girl called Gracie Sowerbuts. Gracie was the head gardener's daughter here at Samlesbury Hall in 1612. She was brought into the courts. Roger Nowell, the local magistrate, picked her up and put her on top of her desk so the jury could see her. And the judges said, "Right, young lady, read out your testimony against these three witches." "I will, sir. I was walking along the banks of the River Ribble, sir. It was a hot summer's day. I saw Jane Southwood and the two Brayley sisters, sir, swimming in the River Ribble, sir. I then saw these unusual dogs. I've never seen the breed before, sir. Huge dogs with huge heads, long backs, cloven hooves. They jumped into the river, sir. They materialised into human beings. They picked up all three women. They danced in a circle, paired off for a meal. I then watched from a distance, sir, as fraternisation was taking place with these demonic spectres. On the second day, Ellen Brayley came to see me. Sir, she changed from a woman into a dog, and she tried to smother me under a blanket of straw, but I escaped, sir. On the third day, the three of them came to see me, and Jane Southwood said, "Ah, Gracie, would you like to have a bit of fun?" "Fun? What? Where?" "Well, at Samlesbury Hall, a little boy called Thomas Walshman's just been born to one of the footmen." "So," said young Gracie, "we'd like to drink his blood. He hasn't been christened yet." No, I don't want to get involved in that," said young Gracie. In the courts at Lancaster, James Altham was about to pick up the gavel and shout the sentence to death, but his colleague Bromley said, No, let her finish her testimony." "Sir, in the dead of night, they made their way into the long gallery at Samlesbury Hall where the little boy was sleeping, sir. They picked him out of the cot. Over 3 nights, sir, they pricked his stomach and they consumed his blood. He then died and was interred at Samlesbury Church, sir. They went back after the funeral, sir, in the early hours of the morning. They dug up the coffin, took the baby out of the coffin, boiled the baby's flesh, consumed the flesh and kept some body fats to enable them to change shape, sir. That was it. James Altham picked the gavel. "Right, we find the three of you guilty of witchcraft. You'll die like the rest of them." Before the gavel came down, Jane Southwood pulled off what I can only describe as a miracle. "Sir, I beg of you, sir, to cross-examine this young girl, sir. She's been manipulated by a Catholic priest called Thompson, hiding at Samlesbury Hall, sir. Just that one word, Catholicism, made the judges sit back.
You're an Anglican, you say?
Yes, sir, I'm an Anglican. I'm married into the Southwood family, so they've never liked me, sir, because of my Anglican views, sir. This young girl has been manipulated by a Catholic priest to falsely incriminate me and my two friends, sir. Please cross-examine her. There was a hushed silence in the courts that day. The judges and the magistrates stood up and took Gracie next door. You can imagine Jane Southworth and the two Brayley sisters must have been on tenterhooks, waiting for the verdict. Were they going to die? Were they going to live? After quite a long period of time, the court was resumed. James Altham sat down with Bromley, Thomas Potts, and indeed Roger Noel, William Holden, John Bannister, and said these words.
In the light of new evidence, we find you, Jane Southworth, you and Jean Brayley, innocent of the crimes against you. You are free to go. The three of them hugged each other. They jumped for joy. Sir Richard made his way from Samlesbury Hall to Lancaster City Castle to pick up all three women to bring them back home again. As Jane turned, she saw the silhouette of Lancaster City Castle. Behind that, Williamson's Park, the place of execution. And there she saw the Pendwiches hanging and blowing in the wind. At the end of the pillory were three empty nooses, and she realised she had not only saved her life but the lives of her two friends as well. But the story doesn't really end there. They came back here to this very room under this very beams and had a celebration meal. For many years afterwards, historians argue between the Pendle witches and the Samlesbury Hall witches. It was clarified by Thomas Potts, who was clerk to the courts when he wrote a book called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire in 1613, that Anne Whittle and indeed Elizabeth Southern, Catherine Hewitt and Alison Devise had familiars in the form of four dogs, Tib, Ball, Fancy, Dandy. And these were described as being familiars. 200 years later, in a lovely old village pub called the Worley Arms in the village of Worley near Clitheroe, two local doctors sat round a glowing fire, Dr. Whitaker, Dr. Dawson, and they discussed both cases. And Whitaker said to Dawson, I believe young Gracie Sarbutt was telling the truth. How? Said his companion. Well, the way she's described these four dogs in the River Ribble. Could have been Tib, Ball, Fancy and Dandy. Remember, she was not in court that day, so therefore she would not have heard the description of these familiar dogs. I believe that's what she's seen. Secondly, let's write to the Archbishop of York and get permission to exhume the Walshman grave. They wrote to York. York Minster dispatched the Reverend John Franks to Samlesbury, and under Church of England supervision, they started to dig. 2 feet beneath the surface, they came across a 1612 lozenge-shaped child's coffin. The coffin was opened and found to contain absolutely nothing. Who knows? Young Gracie Sarbutt may just have been telling the truth. We shall never, ever know. What I would like to say is thank you very much indeed for watching today. I hope you come to Samlesbury Hall because it's, as you've gathered, it is a hotbed of stories and a hotbed of paranormal activity. Thank you very much indeed.